The cold wind that swept across the English coastline carried the smell of salt and rust. In the dim light of dawn, a Royal Navy vessel cut through the mist, its deck lined with figures wrapped in drab gray coats. They were not soldiers. They were German women, nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries from the collapsing remnants of the Reich, taken prisoner in the dying months of war. As the ship neared the British port of Tilbury, the sound of boots echoed across the deck. A British officer barked orders, his tone clipped but devoid of cruelty. The women watched in silence, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and disbelief. For many, this was their first sight of British soil, a land they had been taught to despise, now their place of captivity. The morning fog lifted to reveal cranes, warehouses, and columns of soldiers moving in precise formation. Everything seemed immense and orderly, imbued with an industrial might they had not imagined. The women exchanged glances. This was not the image of a war-torn enemy their propaganda had described. Among them stood Helene Kruger, a 26-year-old communications assistant who had served with the Luftwaffe near Hamburg. Her hands were raw from cold, her uniform threadbare. She stared at the vast dockyard, unable to comprehend how the nation her superiors called decadent had built such power, and had won. When the British soldiers began unloading supplies with mechanical efficiency, Helene felt a sharp pang of confusion. Here was a nation untouched by ruin, whose discipline did not come from fear, but from purpose. As the prisoners were lined up for processing, the voice of a British officer rang out, steady and calm. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention." For the first time in months, Helene felt the faint echo of dignity. She looked toward the Union Jack fluttering above the pier, and the truth settled within her like a stone sinking into deep water. Germany's war was over, but her understanding of what had truly been lost had only begun. The women had prepared for hostility. They expected jeers, contempt, perhaps even retaliation. Yet, when they disembarked, the British guards did not strike them or shout. Instead, they offered them bread and tea. Helene accepted the tin cup with trembling hands. The warmth spread through her fingers and up her arms, melting a small part of the numbness that had grown inside her since the final days in Hamburg. Around her, other women began to whisper, their fear shifting into quiet bewilderment. The British soldiers maintained a respectful distance, their faces unreadable, their discipline absolute. There was no hatred here, only a firm, almost mechanical order. The very sight of it struck Helene with shame. For years, she had believed in a narrative of German superiority, of unyielding resolve and unmatched strength. But standing amid the calm efficiency of her captors, she realized how hollow those boasts had been. The harbor stretched endlessly before her, alive with movement and industry. Trains rumbled, cranes groaned, and soldiers moved in rhythm, as though guided by an invisible pulse of purpose. Britain had survived years of bombing, blockade, and loss, yet it stood taller than before. Helene lowered her gaze, unable to reconcile the pride she once felt with the reality around her. She had come expecting vengeance and humiliation, but instead, she encountered order, mercy, and a strength forged not from domination, but from endurance. It was a quiet reversal, but a devastating one. By the spring of 1945, Germany's war machine had collapsed into chaos. Cities lay in ruins, supply lines disintegrated, and the front lines dissolved into surrender. Amidst this disintegration, tens of thousands of German women, many serving in auxiliary roles, found themselves caught in the advancing tide of Allied power. These women were not front-line soldiers. They were radio operators, clerks, nurses, and members of the Luftwaffe Helferinnenkorps, drawn from across the Reich to support the war effort. As the Allied armies advanced, many were captured in makeshift camps, hospitals, and abandoned headquarters. Britain, still recovering from its own immense sacrifices, now faced the challenge of processing an unprecedented number of prisoners of war. Among them were several thousand women, an unexpected addition to the camps built primarily for male soldiers. The decision to transport female prisoners to British soil was practical, rather than punitive. Britain needed labor to assist with post-war reconstruction, and it sought to adhere strictly to the Geneva Convention. Yet beneath this policy lay a deeper objective: to confront the myths of German invincibility by exposing its agents, even the young and frightened among them, to the resilience of their former enemies. The arrival of these women marked a symbolic inversion of power. For years, German propaganda had painted Britain as weak, decadent, and morally corrupt. Now, the women who had echoed those beliefs saw the truth with their own eyes. A nation wounded but unbroken, organized, and dignified in victory. At the heart of this transformation was discipline. The British military, though weary from 6 years of war, maintained its code of conduct with unwavering precision. It was not a culture of cruelty, but of control, a reflection of a national spirit that had endured bombardment and deprivation without surrendering to despair. For the German women prisoners, this contrast was profound. Many had lived under a regime that preached superiority through obedience and violence, yet here they saw strength expressed through restraint. It was a revelation that unsettled the very foundations of what they had been taught. The British authorities assigned the women to controlled labor duties, agricultural work, laundry services, and hospital maintenance. Each camp became a small, self-contained world, where the captives and their guards coexisted within a fragile framework of order. The experience would test their assumptions, their pride, and ultimately, their humanity. And for Helene Kruger, it would open a moral reckoning that would follow her long after the barbed wire came down. Life inside the British prisoner of war camp was unlike anything Helene had imagined. Situated on the rolling fields of rural Lincolnshire, the camp was surrounded not by walls of stone, but by tall fences of wire. Beyond them stretched farmland and the distant silhouettes of English villages, quiet, neat, and almost untouched by the ruin that had swallowed Germany. Each morning, the sound of a bugle signaled the beginning of the day. The women lined up for roll call, their breaths visible in the chill air. The guards moved efficiently, taking attendance without raised voices or unnecessary force. Breakfast was plain: porridge, bread, and weak tea. But to women who had survived on scraps in the final weeks of the war, it felt almost luxurious. Helene ate slowly, her eyes fixed on the steam curling upward from her tin bowl. The days followed a rhythm that gradually softened the shock of captivity. Work assignments varied. Some women cleaned barracks, others laundered uniforms, while the more educated ones assisted British clerks with paperwork. Helene was placed in a communications office, where she copied inventory logs and maintained radio equipment under supervision. The British officers were stern, but not cruel. They demanded punctuality, precision, and quiet obedience. Yet, unlike the overseers of the Reich, their authority came without threat. It was a strange form of order, built on mutual acknowledgement rather than fear. In the evenings, when the sun dipped behind the hills, the women gathered near the barracks to talk softly. Some spoke of home, of cities turned to ash, of fathers lost at the front, of children left behind in the chaos. Others refused to speak at all, their silence a shield against the collapse of everything they had believed in. Helene often sat apart, staring toward the horizon where the sky met the sea. She thought of her brother, killed in the ruins of Berlin, and of the propaganda broadcasts she had once helped transmit. Her own voice had carried words of defiance, promises of final victory, while the world around her burned. Now, surrounded by the quiet order of her captors, she felt those words like a weight pressing on her chest. Occasionally, British civilians visited the camp to deliver supplies. Some offered polite nods or brief smiles. Others looked away, unwilling to see the human faces of their former enemies. But over time, small gestures began to bridge the gulf of hatred. A nurse shared an apple. A farmer offered a piece of cloth for mending. Tiny acts of decency that defied the logic of war. On Sundays, the camp chaplain held voluntary services. The sermons were gentle, focused on forgiveness and endurance. Helene attended once, sitting in silence as the chaplain spoke of redemption. Not as absolution, but as responsibility. It was then that she began to understand what true strength meant. It was not the loud, violent certainty she had been taught to admire, but the quiet discipline that rebuilt rather than destroyed. Months passed. The camp became less a prison and more a mirror, reflecting what the war had taken from both sides, and what remained worth preserving. As winter turned to spring, Helene's bitterness began to dissolve. The daily structure that had once felt like punishment became a strange comfort. There was dignity in routine, in completing one's work, in existing without fear. One evening, while repairing a radio receiver, she found herself humming an old song her mother used to sing. A British officer nearby paused, listening. When she noticed his gaze, she froze, but instead of scolding her, he gave a slight nod and said, "It is good to hear music again." In May of 1945, the war officially ended. Across Britain, church bells rang for the first time in years. The guards smiled openly, the weight of exhaustion finally lifting from their shoulders. Inside the camp, the news spread slowly. Some of the German women wept, others stared in disbelief. The war that had consumed their youth, their families, and their beliefs was over. Helene stood outside the barracks, watching the British flag ripple in the wind. She expected triumphalism, vengeance, but none came. Instead, the camp's routine continued with quiet dignity. The victors carried themselves not with arrogance, but with relief. Later that evening, a British officer addressed the prisoners. "The war is finished," he said simply. "You are safe here until your repatriation is arranged. You will be treated with respect, as you have been." His voice trembled slightly. It was not the tone of a conqueror, but of a man who had seen too much loss. That night, Helene wept for the first time in years. Not out of fear or despair, but out of clarity. She saw now that strength could be merciful, that victory need not demand cruelty. The world she had known was gone, but in its place, something fragile and beautiful had emerged. A glimpse of what peace could mean. Months later, in the winter of 1946, Helene's name appeared on the list for repatriation. The journey back to Germany was a long and somber one. As the ship departed British shores, she watched the coastline fade into the mist, the same way she had first seen it upon arrival. But her heart was different now. When she reached Hamburg, the sight broke her. The city was unrecognizable, a wasteland of bricks and twisted steel. Streets where she had once walked were now rivers of rubble. The air smelled of smoke and dust, even a year after the bombs had fallen. The survivors moved like ghosts, scavenging among the ruins. Food was scarce, hope scarcer. Helene wandered through what had once been her neighborhood, clutching a parcel given to her by a British nurse. A loaf of bread, some tea, and a note that read, "For the future." She found no trace of her family. Her mother had died in the final air raids. Her brother's grave lay somewhere beneath the ruins of Berlin. For weeks, she lived among the displaced, volunteering at a makeshift hospital to tend to children suffering from malnutrition. The skills she had learned in captivity, organization, calm, endurance, became her lifeline. Occasionally, she encountered others who had returned from British camps. They spoke of the same revelation, that the enemy they had feared was, in truth, the example of what their own country could have been had it chosen decency over domination. Helene began to write letters to those she had met in Britain, the chaplain, the officer, the nurse who had given her food. She thanked them not for mercy, but for showing her that humanity could survive even after such darkness. The ruins around her no longer symbolized defeat. They were foundations waiting to be rebuilt. And in that fragile reconstruction, she saw the faint outline of redemption. Years later, as Europe rebuilt itself from ashes, Helene often revisited her memories of that distant camp in Lincolnshire. She remembered the misty mornings, the measured discipline of the British soldiers, and the quiet power of a nation that had won without losing its soul. The war had taken everything, her family, her homeland, her youth, but it had also revealed an enduring truth, that true victory lies not in conquest, but in compassion. When she spoke to young Germans about her experience, she would say, "We believed strength was measured in fear, but I learned that strength is measured in mercy." Her words carried the weight of lived understanding, the kind that only emerges when illusions are stripped away. And so, from the silence of captivity, emerged a lesson greater than any victory parade. That the measure of a civilization is not how it fights its enemies, but how it treats them once the fighting is done.